Hi, everybody. So today, Chris and I want to spend some time talking to you about the structure of your research papers, right? By this point in the process, this week, you should be working on putting together your second source report. You should also be working on submitting your third essay. If you have any questions on either of those, we're available. Shoot us emails. I have office hours next week. Um, I can be available at different times if those don't work for you. And the same goes for Chris. So just let us know if there's any questions you have on the source report or anything like that. Maybe third essay, and we can meet up and chat about those things. So today I want to talk a little bit about putting together the research paper. This week on our module, I included a research project outline and structure kind of piece of guidance, and this is really going to help you think about putting your essay together and thinking about an effective way of structuring your ideas, to kind of help give you like the building blocks of what the research paper will look like. The research paper should be, somewhere in that like 5-page neighborhood. And so I think that kind of like looking at some of this that's on the outline and some of these questions that I pose in the outline will really help you develop those ideas out. Next week, I'm going to be giving you guys samples of research papers, so you're able to see what other students have done, and kind of see the way that they crafted their arguments, see some of the things that work well, maybe some of the areas that need some development, and be able to have that sample to be able to go off of. So, and then in addition to that, we'll be available to meet with you, read the stuff that you have so far, talk about the structure of your individual papers. So from here on out to the end of the semester, after turning in essay 3 this week, we're just working to the research paper up to finals week. That's the last thing that you'll turn in for this class. And I'll post the due date for that soon. It'll be during finals week that you'll be turning that in. So let me share my screen really quick, and then we'll be talking about the structure of the research paper. So this is just taken directly, just to, what's in our module for this week under research project outline and structure. Okay, so I want to talk about kind of each component, thinking about the introduction to this essay, the body paragraphs broken up into 2 different points, or kind of 2 different sections of the body of your essay, and then your conclusion. If it's helpful for you, you could break this paper up into different parts, meaning that like you could say like part 1 is your introduction. This is going to be different as far as length from a previous essays that you wrote. So your introduction for this paper should be about at least a page, right? So if you wanted to say like part 1 introduction, then you could make that whole first part your intro, make a part 2, make it at the body, the 2 sections of your body, and then a part 3 is kind of like your analysis, your conclusion. So if that helps you, you're welcome to do it that way. And I'll show you a sample that does that. And if you want to just put it together where you don't have it broken up into parts, that's fantastic too. So just your intro, your body of your essay, and then your conclusion. So let's talk a little bit about like what each one of these sections should do. So your introduction. In your introduction, you want to make sure that you're doing a number of things. First of all, you want to make sure that you're defining the community and the specific problem that affects members of the community, right? So I should know who is this community you're talking about. If it's a specific city, you should be able to give some detail about that, maybe break down a little bit of the demographic of the city. If it's a specific like cultural community, make me feel like I understand who this community is. There's people that are writing about art communities. There's people that are writing about gender. There's people that are writing about homelessness. There's people that are writing about specific cities. So whatever that specific community is that you're addressing, make sure that you bring your reader up to speed on who are members of that community, some of the details about that community, and just make us feel like we have context for that. Yeah. Next, it should be very clear on what the problem is specifically and how that problem affects members of that community. So don't be too general here. Like, don't just say, something like police violence or homelessness. I should know specifically what about homelessness, what problem are you focusing on specifically in your essay? Are you focusing on maybe public health within homelessness? If you're focusing on police violence, are you focusing on police violence against one specific ethnicity? Are you focusing on it, physical violence? Are you focusing on, the way that, police shootings, arrest processes, like what are you focusing on specifically, right? So this will also kind of help narrow your essay down and give the reader context in the introduction. It's really important to think about this second blip, right? Is that you're writing for an outsider of the community. That's one potential, right? Like I may not belong to the community that you're writing about, right? So that's also kind of interesting to think about this idea of like from a, writing for an outsider perspective that you need to give a bunch of context to bring that person in to be able to understand this community, understand the problem that it's facing. And then number two, I haven't read the same research that you have. I've read your source reports or I'm reading them as they're being turned in, but the other articles, I haven't read them, right? And so it's really important, just like we've been talking about all semester, that you build context for your reader so that your reader feels like they're up to speed with what the issue is that you're exploring. So again, pretend, because in this case it's very true that your reader does not have the same context that you do for this issue. You're the expert in this situation, so you need to make sure that you're giving the details that we need to be able to have enough to go on to follow in throughout your introduction to the body of your essay. In your intro, obviously you don't need to go into the same level of detail that you do throughout your body paragraphs, but if you want to kind of bring up one of your your points, identifying the problem in a little bit of specificity, or kind of looking at like some details from a source on the community, something like that, like you definitely can do this there. But make sure that you know that in your intro, right, because your intro is going to be about a page long, maybe a little bit more than a page, that you don't need to go into a ton of detail because that's coming later on in your body paragraphs.
And I would say always make
Yeah, go
sure
ahead,
that
Chris.
the context you bring up in your introduction is that sort of information that your reader is going to need to understand your thesis, understand your paper.
Mhm. Exactly. And that's a really great point, right? Like that context, and that context can be brought up too. One of the blips that I put here, through LR10, you became familiar with a database called Gale, and this would be a great place. Gale is a really great database that you could just look it up in the library list of databases, where you can plug in a specific issue. Once you plug in that issue and do a search for that issue, Gale gives like a very general overview of that issue, kind of like brings you up to speed with what's happening with that issue. And that can be one of those things where like you can look for a source for Gale to be able to, excuse me, to be able to help give your introduction context. If any of you have questions or want to meet next week on Zoom during office hours or at a different time and want to look for an example of that with me, I'm happy to meet with you. Chris did a workshop. We're available to do that, where we're like helping you fine tune your research. So if you're not familiar with that Gale database and you want help being able to find that, please talk to me and I can help you do that.
My video is posted in the announcements. Feel free to
That's
check it
right.
out if you're struggling with any of this.
So you could strengthen the efficacy of your introduction by persuading your reader through ethos, pathos, and or logos, right? So we talked about that like when we're hooking the reader, right? Ethos is thinking about like the ethics, right? Pathos is emotion and logos is logic, right? And people are motivated through these different things, right? So it's like, can you maybe, if you're identifying a problem in a community, like there can be an ethical dilemma, right? Like we can look at something and say, like, ethically, you should care about this issue, right? That if we're, good Samaritans or believe in civil rights or, believe in equal rights for all people, that this is an issue that should be important to us. Emotionally, you can kind of tug at people's like heartstrings, so to speak, right? Where it's like, if you are showing an issue and maybe for your hook of your paper, there could be some statistics that show like, how much death is happening within the homeless community, and maybe kind of something like that emotionally can compel your reader to see it as a very important issue. And then logically, using data can motivate your reader either or also. So make sure that like you're kind of like pulling the reader into the paper by showing why this is such a severe problem and why this needs to be addressed. And then make sure your introduction contains a clear thesis or prevailing question. So your thesis would be similar to thesis statements you've written in the past in this class, right? What is your argument? A prevailing question can be a little bit different than that. Sometimes we go into our research and we don't quite know the answer of what we're looking for, right? So like I could say, for example, like within the homeless community, if I see this problem that's happening throughout Fairfield, that the number of homeless individuals in Fairfield is increasing, the number of services that we have in our community is decreasing. I see that there's a very clear problem. I can see it every day when I drive around town. However, I'm not quite sure what the best way is to fix that. I have some ideas, but I don't know if those are the best possible options. So one of the things I can do, instead of making like a straightforward thesis statement where I'm like, we need significant intervention in our community to be able to help this community, whatever the case is, I could say, based on these problems that I see, what is the best possible solution to deal with the catastrophic homeless situation in Fairfield? Then your research paper will kind of explore what that is. So it doesn't have to be like, I know what this is 100% and here's what I'm arguing. Sometimes from a research standpoint, we come at it, and I know in the past I was like, don't ask many questions in your thesis, because before you were making your argument. But in research, we're kind of coming through things from a little bit like, I've got to find this out and I'm going to explore this. And then when you get to your end, your conclusion, here's what I think is the best possible solution. So it's okay to have like a question here in this case for your thesis. So your thesis can argue a specific problem that you see affecting members of the selected community, and the prevailing question can address the potential causes or identified for the problem and solution, right? So that's kind of what you should be doing in the introduction. So that should take you, again, that should be somewhere in the neighborhood of a page, a little bit more than a page, right? But I would say definitely a page minimum for writing your intro. The body paragraphs for this essay, or kind of like the body of this essay, you should think about being broken up into 2 parts. Each one of these parts, identifying the community and presenting the problem and solutions to the problem, each of these should be several body paragraphs each. So I would imagine this section in here, identifying the community and presenting the problem, should be at least 3 paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs. And then this down here, solutions to the problem, same thing, should be at least 3 paragraphs or so, right? So together your body should be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 6 paragraphs. The body of this essay, these combined sections, should be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 pages, right? Just to kind of give you a little bit of context of how big this should be. So here's what you should be doing in this first section. Pretty straightforward: identify the community and present the problem. So your first body paragraph in this research paper should be about identifying the community and the observed problem in more detail. So you need to, in this section, convince the reader of the severity of this problem to make sure that the reader understands that this is a big issue this community is facing. The way that you do that is using outside sources. This is not, now there can be instances where you're using personal observation, but because this is your research paper, right? And because our arguments become stronger when we're using outside sources, when we've been practicing this semester, your body paragraphs have to be supported by research that you found. So even if you're using a personal experience about something that you've observed, or in a situation where you observe this problem, fine, but it has to be supported by an outside source. So in other words, what research did you find to back it up? Go ahead, Chris.
That's not to say that like your own personal experience is not valuable. That can be great in convincing your reader. But by using outside sources, you're telling your reader, like, this is not just my opinion. This is backed up by other people in the field, by other facts out there.
Exactly, right? Like, the reason we collect our research is to convince our reader that our arguments are strong, right? That's why we're doing it. It's like, it's kind of one of those things of like, not taking my word, but looking at what everybody else is saying. It's one thing for me to say, oh, I think this is a good idea. Fine. But if I show you compelling research into why this is a good idea, or what how this community is being impacted, now I have a bunch of experts behind me. It's kind of like that idea of like becoming taller by standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Or imagine like if you're standing up and you have 50 voices behind you that are arguing the same thing, now your voice is that much more powerful. So every body paragraph that you put out in your essay should have some sort of source backing it up. I should see tons of versions of paraphrases, quotes, in-text citations. Like, these should all be coming out. That's why you start with the research and then you write the paper. Next, make sure that each body paragraph supported by strong examples and analysis. Really, really important. Tell me, show me, so what? What is your claim? What is your evidence? And how does this evidence, like, what should your reader know or think about this evidence, right? Like, how does it come back to relate with your analysis or with what the point of your essay is? And each body paragraph should build on each other, right? Like that there should be kind of a clear relationship between the purpose of these body paragraphs and why they're ordered in the way that they are. So sometimes, we've talked about order in body paragraphs, right? Like sometimes it's maybe there's a cause and effect relationship. First this happens, then that happens. Sometimes it's a sequence, right? This is first, over time we start to see this happening, and then eventually it leads to that. Sometimes we want to think about the order of body paragraphs can be really important when we're thinking about severity, right? So like, let's say, for example, if we're talking about homelessness within the community, because it's a popular issue that a lot of people are exploring, and we see that maybe one of the problems is that people are suffering from an increased rate of addiction, right? And then the next issue is that you start talking about the mortality rate or the amount of deaths that happen to people in the homeless community. That should probably be your last point, because that idea of death is the most severe, right? And so it's kind of like, if we read about death first and then went into an issue of starting to look at like alcoholism, I'd be like, yes, alcoholism is a massive problem or a massive issue that deserves our attention, but hearing about people that are dying on the streets is much more severe than that, right? And so I think that, like, think about the order of your ideas. Sometimes severity is the order that you want to lay them out, but there should be some attention to why this paragraph before that one, and so on.
I mean, think of it the same way that like any story is made compelling. If
Mhm.
Thanos showed up at the beginning of Avengers and the rest of it was them just kind of like hanging out and talking about stuff, like that's not as compelling of a narrative as if they saved that for the very end of the narrative. It's the same idea. Like save the most like impactful thing towards the end of your argument.
All right, good. So, sorry, I had a kid issue on the sideline that I was like muting my mic and taking an AirPod out. So it's the fun of kids still at home from school while you're working from home. All right. So the next part of the body, right? This second part of the body is solutions to the problem, right? So again, this should be, somewhere in the neighborhood of a few paragraphs, right? And a lot of the stuff is going to be the same. So the remaining body paragraphs of your research project should show the solutions that you've researched. So each of your solutions should, again, be supported by research, right? Like, every solution you're showing me here, what evidence have you found to show why this is effective? What evidence have you found to say, like, here's why we think this is an appropriate way of going about solving this problem? So find evidence to be able to back it up, right? So you may have found some sources describing support programs are structured that maybe you think could be applied to your community or could be used on a larger scale, right? Make sure that you have a connection between what you read and what your argument is. Again, the reader has not read the same articles that you have. So we need to have enough detail and analysis so that we can clearly see the connection, right? That's really, really important. Again, I cannot stress that enough, that I need context as your reader, because I don't know this issue. I don't know, short of reading your research proposals or reading your source reports and meeting with some of you individually to work on your research projects together, like, I'm an unaware audience, so I need context to be able to follow along with what's going on here. This next part, right? Sometimes people are criticals of solutions, right? There's a lot of debate that comes around solution. And people are really critical of this. People could say, well, this is too expensive, right? Or it's too hard to implement, or there's drawbacks to doing this, right? So like, we hear that a lot. If people are talking about like, going again on the topic of homelessness, we hear that very, very regularly. Well, it's like, well, we need a shelter in Fairfield. Well, it's super expensive to build a shelter. Or we'll have people say, well, I don't want a shelter built near my house, right? Kind of like one of those not in my backyard arguments. I feel like whenever there's any kind of possible solution to an issue, there's always a counter argument against it, right? Even on our campus, before we had to leave and go to everything online, we wanted to have gender neutral bathrooms in all of our buildings, and it seemed like a pretty easy solution, right? Just like, cool, these bathrooms that were single occupancy use are now going to be gender neutral. Put a sign up, done and done. Immediately, there were several emails that were coming out from people. There was concern about, you know, where are some staff going to go to the restroom? Where are faculty going to go to the restroom? What if more people start using these restrooms than before? What about cleanliness? What about safety? I mean, it just became this whole thing that, like, I thought was a very simple solution, turned into this massive series of counter arguments. I feel like anytime that you see someone says, like, here's what I think is a way to address this issue, somebody has some sort of argument as to why this may not be the best way, or there might be a better way of doing it. This is going to be true in research also, right? There's going to be competing ideas on what people believe to be an effective way of going about solving something. For example, within homelessness, I was helping a student earlier work on a paper. There are some communities that have right to shelter laws, right? New York City being one of these. And so in New York City, there's right to shelter availability where they have like these apartment buildings that are wide open, hotel buildings that are wide open, where people are able to check in at those instead of sleeping on the streets. And it seems like a pretty, straightforward solution. Okay, cool. There's a place where people can sleep, they can bathe, they can, be sheltered and not freeze to death and die on the streets. And so people are very critical of these, however, because they're not maintained, there's no counseling, there's no intervention, and people will argue that people are in more so danger for being in these places because they're running rampant with drug use, they're running rampant with violence, right? And that this isn't a solution. This is just kind of sweeping a problem underneath the rug. So there's a controversy there within that issue. Some people who are experts in that field think that's a good idea. Some people who are experts in that field think it's a horrible idea. You'll find this to be true in the issue that you're exploring also. So I think in your body paragraphs, as you're starting to put forward the solutions, it's important to acknowledge counter argument, right? And then it's also important to think about this idea, is the counter argument have some validity? And does it make some of your solutions impractical? So there can be strong validity to a counter argument, right? So like I would look at some certain issues, and there are issues that are expensive, right? Plain and simple, very, very expensive to carry out. But if we look at those issues that are expensive and we say, yes, I recognize this is expensive, I don't ignore that counter argument. However, it's worth the money to address this issue, right? Just like if we were to say like, oh, well, this would be hard to do. Okay, sure. But let's giddy up and let's do the hard work because it's worth doing this in the end, right? And it's that same kind of idea. Like we have that happen all the time on campus. Like there's things that we want, right? Like for example, Chris being part of our class, we had to fight to be able to keep this program because the program's expensive and the program takes a lot of institutional support. And I would say, sure, I acknowledge the program is not cheap compared to other support programs, but here is why we need the program. So sometimes if we closed off, if someone's like, hey, this program's expensive, and you're just like, okay, and you ignore that counter argument, you're not being critical of it. Instead, say, I acknowledge this, but here is why I think it's outweighed by this other thing, right? Just like people maybe saying, hey, having a homeless shelter very close to homes could affect people's, I don't know, property values or things like that. You can acknowledge there's some validity to that argument. However, do you think the benefits of creating this shelter outweighs that? And that's what's really important to think about, right? And it's like, just like the same thing with our bathrooms. It used to be, especially being one of the only men in the 700 hallway where the faculty restroom is, once that restroom changed over to a gender neutral restroom for everybody, faculty, staff, students, sometimes I had to wait in line to go to the bathroom, right? Between classes. Okay, fine. It's worth it for me if that makes somebody feel more comfortable to be able to go into a restroom that better suits them. So I would say, yeah, there's truth to that. Sometimes I have to wait in line. I never had to before. Now I do. But I don't care because the benefit of that small problem outweighs that small problem, right? And so I think that that's what you should think about. Acknowledge counter argument, right? But then show why you think your solution is so powerful.
I would say even if even if you find a counter argument that you like really agree with and you're like, oh man, like this is a real problem for whatever solution I was thinking of, That's okay, because
Mhm.
that shows that you're still like considering all sides, and it shows like depth in your argument.
Exactly.
You could bring up a solution, come up with like a counter argument that really just like destroys it, and like come with a conclusion of that is like, well, maybe there's some interest in this in the solution, but we need to think about it differently now because
Exactly.
counter argument. That's still a strong paper.
Yeah. And I think that's the way that issues are in real life, right? I mean, talk about any issues that we're talking about right now. Like, really complex issues don't have very clear, like, light switch on and off solutions. They're messy, right? Like, we really have to, like, I'm on a committee next week. We're meeting to have discussions about what does it look like to return to campus with the restrictions that we have. And in a perfect world, I would say, everybody, let's go. Class is back face to face, right? But it's like, it's not that simple. It's messy, right? It's going to take a lot of concern. It's going to take a lot of care. It's going to take a lot of kind of like, looking at the solutions, looking at potential problems, right? Like, any issue that we talk about is not, for the most part, this clear 100% cut and dry, black and white, yes or no answer. There's nuance there, there's complexity there, right? Like, I run across those issues all the time where I'm like, well, I could do this, I could not do this, I could think about it this way. It's like, it's complex. And so it's okay. To Chris's point, it's a great point of this idea of like, be aware of that complexity in these ideas, and maybe you say, hey, this is a great solution, but we need to really think about how we could implement this in a responsible way, right? Or paying attention to what the potential drawbacks are. So make sure each body paragraph, again, support them with strong examples and analysis that tell me, show me, so what. And same idea, make sure that they're built on each other, right? So that the structure is there. So your conclusion. And again, you can label this if you want to. You could just make it part of the essay, all coherent. It's totally up to you, right? If you want to break this up, little Roman numerals, whatever works for you. Sometimes it's easy with larger essays, but you don't have to. So for your conclusion, for this part of your project, you should identify the best possible solution, or maybe solutions to the problem that you'd identified. And then this is where, kind of to Chris's point, is this solution practical? Right? Is this something that's very easy to be implemented? Is this something that's going to take a lot of work to be implemented? Um, how can it be implemented? Maybe it starts small and then it grows from there. Maybe we model it in very small situations, and hopefully, just like if I think about this TA program that Chris is a part of that we have in our class, it would be awesome if we had this at every single class on campus. That's not practical, right? But I think that we can get there. I think that if we start small, we started with English, we moved out into math, we're moving out into some different classes, talking to one of my friends who teaches anthropology, maybe getting a TA there, right? Like, moving out, then I could say over time, maybe we could cast this out throughout campus. But I couldn't just be like, boom, TAs in every single class, let's giddy up and go. That's not a practical way of going about solving this issue, right? Um, so how do you think it could be implemented? Once it's implemented, or as it's implemented, how will it affect the community? Like, why should we implement this? And then finally, maybe to help with your final analysis, your conclusion, that kind of final takeaway, what will the community look like after this solution is carried out? So kind of in this perfect world, right? You have your druthers, you got your way of thinking about these things, your solutions in place. What does this community look like now? Maybe how it looked before in your introduction. If this is carried out, how is this community supported? Right? How is this community changed? How is this community thriving? How is this community affected? Whatever way that you want to think about that, what do things look like if we're able to carry out the solution that you have in mind, or that the research is supporting that this is what's effective? So I think that thinking about your essay in this way, and kind of like outlining your essay before you start writing, right, and following along with this, will be really, really helpful for you to kind of just like give yourself these bullet points, dive into these ideas that you're going to be exploring, and kind of thinking about, what are the points that I want to make? What are the evidence that I'm using for my research to be able to back up those points, to be able to help you put this together? If you have questions on any of this, putting your research paper together, outlining it, please let us know. Let's meet up. Let's talk about this in some detail. Let's look at what you have so far. Let's look at your research. Like, we're here to be able to help you between now and the end of the semester. Like, this is it. We're working on the research paper. We're making ourselves available as much as possible, right? I'm willing to meet with you. I'm meeting with a student tonight at 6 o'clock, right? Like I'm willing to meet with people when they need to be able to meet because, I know that not everybody can make my office hours. So if that's the case, like please let us know and we can find time to be able to meet. What I don't want you doing is getting to the point where you feel like I'm putting this off because I don't know where I'm going with this research paper yet, or I'm stuck with this. Like if you're stuck, that's what we're here for, right? Like please let us know, because if you wait until the end, it's going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to get this finished. I know you have finals and other classes. I like to I have the option for you to turn this in earlier, just this way, in case you want to have finals week to work on your other classes, right? I know people have like, big comprehensive finals at the end of class that you're doing tons of studying for. For my class, it's writing this paper, and this is what's going towards your final grade, right? So again, please let us know if there's any way that we can help. If you have any questions, we're here. Shoot us emails, stop by office hours, and we'll meet up and work through this together. And then next week, I'll have some samples of this. You'll be able to see some research papers to kind of get a little bit of context to what other people are doing and see some of these in some detail. All right, again, please let us know if you have any questions, and we're here to support you.
Yeah, feel free to reach out.